350 years ago. They apply to people anywhere in the world. Perhaps the word people is a good clue to our study and enjoyment of Shakespeare. People with human problems, people with human passions. People living out their lives in different ways, playing, as Shakespeare said, their many parts. People are a link between the atomic age in which we live and the Elizabethan age in which Shakespeare lived. What kind of an age was Shakespeare's time? What kind of a man was William Shakespeare? Today in England, the lovely valley of Warwickshire, where Shakespeare was born and where he lived, is still called Shakespeare Land. It is the very heart of England. The England that gave Shakespeare his language and shaped his character. The Elizabethan England that Shakespeare knew was a land of castles and princes, pomp and ceremony. Kenilworth Castle is part of the pageant of English history that Shakespeare brings to life in his works. During Shakespeare's time, Queen Elizabeth once visited Kenilworth Castle. In the courtyard of the palace, the Queen was entertained with pageants and plays. These were a part of the colorful life that developed during Elizabeth's reign, the age we still call the Elizabethan period. Not far from Kenilworth, on the River Avon, is Stratford. In this town, Shakespeare was born and spent his early life. In Stratford, original half-timbered buildings in the Tudor style give the town an appearance that carries us back to the Elizabethan period. Almost 4 centuries have passed since William Shakespeare was born in this house. But time has only increased Shakespeare's popularity. People come in ever-increasing numbers to see his birthplace. Perhaps people understand Shakespeare because Shakespeare understood people. People who live, think, and behave as human beings do, whether they live in the Elizabethan age or today. Today, boys of Stratford visit the very school that William Shakespeare attended as a boy. And young men of the town walk along the same lane that Shakespeare used as a young man when he went calling on the girl he loved. That girl was Anne Hathaway, and this is her home. Coming to see her here, Shakespeare may have watched for her face at one of these windows. In this living room, Shakespeare probably sat and talked with the girl who became his wife. But all of his life was not spent in Stratford. Much of his work was done in London. Today, in modern London, we can find bits of the city that are of Elizabethan times. Certainly, Shakespeare knew the Tower of London. He set some of the action of his play Richard III in this fortress. In his play King John, Shakespeare refers to the George Inn of London. In the 16th century, plays were often performed in the courtyards of inns. Spectators stood in the courtyard or on the balconies. The first theaters built in England had a similar arrangement. That is, the plays were performed in the center of the theater. The Globe was one of the most famous Elizabethan theaters. Today, the Memorial Theater at Stratford is one of the world's finest playhouses. People come to Stratford not only to see Shakespeare's town, but to see his plays, for after all, the play's the thing. And what has kept the plays so popular through the centuries? Probably one answer is that the human emotions and human behavior of Shakespeare's characters are so effectively expressed that we see our own behavior in them. In this play, we feel the beauty of undying love, as Romeo expresses it.
But soft, what light through yonder window breaks? It is the east, and Juliet is the sun. Arise, fair sun, and kill the envious moon, who is already sick and pale with grief, that thou, her maid, art far more fair than she.
Most of us have known people who are extremely ambitious. In this play, about a struggle for the Scottish throne, the fierce ambition of Lady Macbeth led to murder and tragedy.
Come, you spirits that tend on mortal thoughts, fill me from the crown to the toe, top full of direst cruelty. Make sick my blood, stop up the access and passage.
There is infinite variety in Shakespeare's characters and plays. The Taming of the Shrew is a hilarious love story in which a spirited girl is subdued by a determined young man named Petruchio.
I'll attend her here and woo her with some spirit when she comes. Say that she rails. Why, then I'll tell her plain she sings as sweetly as a nightingale. Say that she frowns. I'll say she looks as clear as morning roses newly washed with dew. Say she be mute and will not speak a word. Then I'll commend her volubility and say she uttereth piercing eloquence.
It isn't difficult for us to understand Shakespeare's people and their actions. Career girls today, for instance, will sympathize with Portia, a woman lawyer, as she pleads her famous case.
The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It is twice blessed. It blesseth him that gives and him that takes. 'Tis mightiest in the mightiest.
Shakespeare's astounding insight into human nature is nowhere better illustrated than in his character of Hamlet. As he faces the dread decision of whether or not to kill his father's murderer, Hamlet's mental struggle is a study in psychology.
To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing, end them.
Yes, Shakespeare's characters are real, dynamic men and women who are as alive today as they were when he first touched them with the spark of his creative genius. Perhaps as we examine the plays in their original form and see the pages set in Old English type, we may feel that a wide gulf of time separates us from these works, and we may have some difficulty in reading and understanding some of the Old English words that Shakespeare used. But with patience, we can get acquainted with Shakespeare's language, and at the same time discover that much of his language is very modern. Have you ever heard anyone say, "This is the short and the long of it"? Or perhaps, "I cannot tell what the dickens his name is"? The plays are full of expressions and phrases that are still part of our daily talk. Let's just listen to some of Shakespeare's phrases.
Neither rhyme nor reason. I'll not budge an inch.
I'll tell the world.
It was Greek to me. The game is up.
With bag and baggage.
Sweets to the sweet. All's well that ends well.
Yes, all of us use Shakespearean language without realizing it. But what else can we learn about the plays? Many of the settings are English settings, places that Shakespeare knew through personal experience. For instance, in As You Like It, the Forest of Arden that Shakespeare described was very likely inspired by the actual Forest of Arden in the Warwick countryside not far from Shakespeare's home. In a number of his plays, Shakespeare sets the scene simply as a heath. And this is what he had in mind, a broad expanse of wasteland, of which there are many examples in England and Scotland. When Shakespeare presented his Merry Wives of Windsor, his audience associated the play with Windsor Castle and its surrounding parks. Still another of the many English settings are the cliffs of Dover on the southeast coast. This region is the setting for part of Shakespeare's King Lear. This precipice is still called Shakespeare Cliff, and the view from it is one that Gloucester describes in the play. There is a cliff whose high and bending head looks fearfully in the confined deep. Yes, Shakespeare knew his England, its people, its beauties, its exciting history. And these elements are part of his plays. But Shakespeare is more than a playwright. He is the playwright-poet. In language of sweeping lyric beauty, Shakespeare gives us pictures of scenes. The gray-eyed morn smiles on the frowning night, checkering the eastern clouds with streaks of light. And flecked darkness, like a drunkard, reels from forth day's path and tightens fiery wheels. Shakespeare's command of the language lends infinite variety to his poetry. Look, love, what envious streaks do lace the severing clouds in yonder east. Night's candles are burnt out, and jocund day stands tiptoe on the misty mountain tops. Born and reared in a land of beauty, it is no wonder that Shakespeare wrote of nature almost by habit. The poet may have been thinking of his own beloved river Avon when he wrote, "Here will we sit, and let the sounds of music creep in our ears. Soft stillness and the night become the touches of sweet harmony." Sweet harmony might well describe Shakespeare's works, a masterful blending of poetry and life. Here in Stratford Church, Shakespeare is buried in the heart of the England he loved. But he lives on in his works, in the immortal characters he created. For Shakespeare, the stage on which he set his men and women was not only the world he knew, but it was a world of people everywhere. The link between ourselves and Shakespeare is a human link. It is a human bond that knows no limits of time and space.